I remember when I first went off on my own, one of the things that made me the most nervous was, what do you ask your client before you get started, and what do you talk about during the prep of the appointment? So what I'm doing in this video is I'm first disinfecting with an alcohol swab, and I'm thoroughly disinfecting her eyebrows. She does have previous work from years ago. But while I'm doing this, questions that I typically ask my client is, how did you find me? Because I want to figure out what marketing tactic is working best and what's bringing clients in. And then I also ask them about the history with their brows. So sometimes they'll say, oh, I had permanent makeup done years ago and I'm not happy with how they faded. This client, for example, didn't have any big grievances on her previous work. They were just faded out and she was hoping that I could touch them up. I did notice that inorganic pigment was used previously, and that's why there's a bit of a salmon hue under her natural growth. With every step I'm doing, I am talking my client through what exactly I'm doing on their face. So yes, we're chatting, but I don't want them to ever wonder like what is going on up there. So I always start them off with signing an intake form, and then I explain to the client, I'm going to disinfect you and make sure that your eyebrows are completely sanitized before we get started. I'm going to lather on numbing cream to make sure you're as comfortable as possible, and then I'm going to do pigment swabs on your forehead, and I'll show you the pigment swabs once I figure out which pigment I want to recommend for you. As you can see in this video, if you're familiar with the pink numbing cream that you see in many of my videos, I am still using TXTK, and it's an orange bottle. They have different brands that I believe are indications of different levels of lidocaine. I do practice under a medical director, so I'm able to use higher percentage of lidocaine, which makes my clients a little bit more comfortable. So you'll see during the session, I've used clips from this video before. She's chatting with me and she never shows any signs of discomfort. If you do practice in Texas, we are only allowed to use up to 5% lidocaine, and it can't be a compound. So for my students, I usually recommend that they use Zensa, and the Zensa that is made for US practice, because there's one for Canada. We don't want that one. We want the one that's meant for the US because it's only 5% lidocaine. If you are using the 5% lidocaine, I will say that you need to be cognizant of how long you're taking numbing, because 5% on its own, again, not a compound, low level of lidocaine percentage, it wears off a little bit quicker. So if you have to dab some on while you're actually working on the brow, make sure you do that. But again, I practice under a medical director, so I'm able to use a little bit stronger numbing than most. Things that I want to make sure that I ask before I start the session are, when was their previous work done, if they've had any, and if they could share what they liked and they didn't like about their experience, as well as the results. And then I also ask them what they're hoping to achieve today. Sometimes what I found is when you ask a client what they're hoping to achieve and they've booked a microblading appointment, they also say they don't want to fill in their brows anymore. And so if a client says that, I would recommend a combination brow. So a combination of microblading and shading, because if you just do microblading on a client who is used to seeing their eyebrows filled in every day, it's not going to be enough for them, and they're still going to need to fill in their eyebrows. Now what you're going to see me do is I'm doing pigment swabs. So on my tray, I have small pigment cups, and I'm combining different pigments, and I'm looking at her natural growth. So best practice, what I recommend doing is ignoring whatever's going on their head, because everyone is dyeing their hair, getting highlights, all the things, and even if they're not, sometimes their natural hair on their head doesn't match the growth on their eyebrows. So the pigments that I'm using are inorganic pigments again. On her type of skin tone, she's very high on the Fitzpatrick scale, so I would never touch an organic pigment on this client. I would never use a hybrid. I would only use inorganic. And I'm swabbing the Velvet line that I order off of Girls Inc. So big fan of that. I mentioned that pigment many times. And then when I'm doing the swabs, now I'm adding droplets of water. So I have a little shot glass with purified water in it, and I'm just dipping the disposable lip gloss applicators, and then I'm dabbing the water on top, because when these pigments dry, they look a lot darker than what they actually are. And I never want to present the client the swabs that I've made while they're dry, because then it's going to leave them really intimidated. They're going to think that the pigments are much darker than what they truly are. And I tend to take off the plastic wrap from one eyebrow, and I explain to them, so I'm looking at your natural growth and I'm trying to figure out which pigment combination would match that as closely as possible when healed. And it's important to mention when healed, because then when you're talking them through the healing process, you should always mention that they'll retain around 60% of the pigment that's implanted. So again, when the pigment heals, it's going to be a lot softer, a lot more natural, a lot more airy. And most of your clients aren't going to have much feedback on this because they're going to trust your judgment. I say that because that puts pressure on you to pick the best pigment possible for every single client. The pigment combination that I decided on with this client was a combination of the mochaccino and the latte from ordered off of Girls Inc., and it's the aqua line. I felt like that was going to heal best on her, so I explained that to her, and then I told her that I was going to bring her up to finish mapping her. And I also always want to mention that they are going to approve of the shape before we get started. It's really important that you say that to the client because it will ease their nerves. I promise you they're wondering about it. If you have any questions, if you found this helpful, leave a comment below, and please ask me all the questions because it will allow me to gear my content towards answering them.